Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am honored to have Chet Richards back. And this time we'll be talking about his book, Certain to Win. So welcome, Chet.
Thank you, Shrikant. Always good to be back. We had
Wonderful.
a lot of fun the last couple of times. So looking forward to an interesting session this time.
Excellent. We have established, we've done, I think, 3 meetups on the ideas of OODA Loop with Chet and with Chuck, and then Chet and Chuck together. So look at the playlist down here. If you have not watched those videos, I would recommend that you watch those videos first and then come back here in order so that you have a very good base in the OODA Loop. All right. So
I would say one thing, by the way, if you're watching those, if you've never done one of these things, I tell you what happens while you're doing them, like Shrikant and I are talking now, at some point, something in your brain will be saying, why did you say that? Why in the world? So just remember, this is unedited. It's just the way it is, and have fun. I won't verify totally for the accuracy of everything in it, but I think everything is, as we used to say, true to nature. If it's not true, it should be. Wonderful. I was heading in the right direction. Fine.
So Chet, tell me about this book. How did it come to be?
Well, I got to go back a little bit. John Boyd finished Patterns of Conflict, finished it. He put the final dated edition of it carries the date of sometime in 1986. And that wasn't so much when he finished it. I think it's when his daughter, Mary Ellen Boyd, left home to go off to college, and she was his typist. At that point, he was able to get a little bit of typing out for the next 2 short presentations, also done in 86, and actually, I guess they have 87 publication dates, and that was basically it. So any revisions that he wanted to make, he would call around the people that he knew had copies of the book and sort of tell them one by one, I want to change this to that and this to that. And probably the best known is chart, I think it's 144, the Iowa High theme for vitality and growth chart. But there are several others. He completely redid the Sun Tzu chart between the time that the handout copies of Patterns of Conflict were sort of frozen in stone, and when he was conceptually happy with what he had done. I would point out that the versions that are out on my website were made by basically Chuck Spinney and I, because I think we got pretty much all of the calls between the two of us, sitting down and comparing notes. And so I collected all of the changes that Chuck had, the changes that I have, and I incorporated them into that edition of Patterns of Conflict. So I think that's very close to the last version of Patterns of Conflict that Boyd might have actually briefed somewhere in around maybe 1990, 1991 or so, somewhere along in there. So anyway, but he had finished the bulk of that activity. And in the winter of 1987, it would have been, and I've got to say how I can remember that is that I was working for an airplane company at the time, Lockheed Martin, Marietta, Georgia, out suburb of Atlanta. They're building C-130s and were doing some of the very, very, very early work on the F-22. But they would close the factory every year from about the end of the first week in December through the day or two after New Year's. And the reason was absenteeism was so high during that period anyway, they couldn't build airplanes, so might as well just go ahead and close the place down and count that against the number of holidays that the union had negotiated. And so I was at our local friendly library, and I picked up, there's a strange book, if you're able to see this or not, Tom Peters' Thriving on Chaos. Now, we had all read Tom Peters' his earlier book, In Search of Excellence, that Ronnie wrote with, I think it was Alan Waterman. Yeah, that was interesting too. But this book was like nothing I had ever seen. And in fact, I detected strains of John Boyd's work all the way through it. So when I got back into the office on nice official Lockheed Martin stationery, I wrote Tom Peters a letter. And I got a letter, virtually right back with an autographed copy of the book. And a thing saying, you're probably right. He said, I had read about Boyd and his group when I read James Fallow's 1982 book, National Defense. And he said, and that, a lot of those ideas stuck about, operating at a more rapid tempo or climate, being ahead of your opponents, causing change rather than trying to react to it, those sorts of things. He said, that's what I was trying to capture in the book. And so that sort of that sort of started a set of briefings. In fact, I think Boyd actually said, well, why don't you've been studying this Toyota production system, so why don't you just collect up all your ideas at a briefing, sort of a mini patterns of conflict, and we'll just iterate some copies of it here. And so for about 2 years, maybe, about once a month, we'd do a new version of this briefing that had collected up John's ideas from Peter's, ideas from Toyota Production System, ideas from Sloan Management Review and Harvard Business Review. We're running a lot of interesting articles at the time. The first articles on lean were just coming out. John Krafcik had just coined the term in the paper that he wrote. I believe it was Sloan Management Review, and papers on how this ability to manipulate time rather than just always driving for a cost advantage and getting bigger and bigger and bigger so that you can achieve economies of scale. That it was better to maybe be smaller and faster. These ideas were just starting to come out in the late 1980s. In 1990 itself, this book came out. You can see it, Stalk and Hoots, Competing Against Time. Still a very good book, by the way. In fact, both of them are very good books. But that was the first book that had a copy of the OODA Loop in it. It was a circular one, observe, then orient, then decide, then act. But it called it the OODA Loop, and it talked about Air Force fighter pilots did all this. Boyd went ballistic. Says, hey, boy, John, there's a book that's got the OODA Loop out in it. No, it doesn't mention you. And as an aside, later on, I think Chuck really was the one that got to him and said, John, the fact that they're not mentioning you means that these ideas are getting out into the wild and beginning to get accepted. At that point, John kind of calmed down, but he wasn't there for this book yet. So I guess he wrote Tom Howe a letter. I wrote him a letter, and I got a return letter with an autographed copy of the book. And since then, in the work that they've done, they have credited with John. That was 1990. That was the very first book that had an OODA Loop in it, and it was another book kind of in the stream of thriving on chaos, of creating chaos and then thriving on it. And the side that can handle an unstructured environment the best will have an advantage if you're operating in an unstructured environment. So the trick is to create an unstructured environment. And Boyd was all about creating unstructured environments. All the patterns of conflict is essentially creating and thriving on, well, complexity, not really chaos, but you know what I mean. So anyway, I had written about, I think it was actually Boyd that said, you need to write all this up in a book, which I thought was rich, of course. The only thing he'd written was one paper, Destruction and Creation, and then everything else was briefings. And he said, well, the reason for that is I'm living here in DC. I'm going around talking to people in the Pentagon, the Air Force, the Army, going to war colleges, and they don't read anything, but they will listen to briefings, even long briefings. He said, but no, you won't have the opportunity to go around every company in the United States. You're going to have to write something. And the first thing I wrote was a paper called Riding the Tiger, and it actually got published in about 92, 93 in a compendium on strategy. But the basic manuscript, which I had started at the time, hadn't given a title to. I think it's still War, Chaos, and Business was the working title. Never could find a publisher for it, even though Boyd and I went through, I don't remember how many drafts by that time. The American Management Associations, which publishes a series of books, and I went deep into it, but at the end they declined because they didn't like the German words. And I actually had a guy who was recommended as a really good agent. Well, I went to Robert Corum. I said, Robert, how do I get it published? You publish all kinds of stuff. And he said, no problem. I'll hook you up with my publisher, Little Brown, I believe it was. And he put up with this editor, and his editor said, well, we don't do these kinds of books, but I know who does. We'll send it over there. The guy said, it's really interesting, but I think we're going to do Hal Roden's Management Secrets of Landing Zone X-Ray, the thing that later became the book We Were Soldiers Once, and Young, and the movie, We Were Soldiers. Excellent movie, by the way. But I don't think the book ever came out. And then I got an agent. The agent said it was really hot on it and everything. Then he decided he didn't like the German words. And so all this dragged on to maybe about the mid-90s. I'm over in Saudi Arabia trying to sell airplanes. And with the help of my good buddy Saddam Hussein, was able to actually sell some to the Saudis. And they're going back and forth and writing some other stuff and kind of totally losing interest. And then Boyd, of course, died in 97. Chuck Spinney, who had known Robert Corum from other things, persuaded Robert to essentially do the biography of John Boyd. And Robert had, as far as I know, he had never done a true biography. He had done a kind of a biography called Bassmaster Rigsby, something like that. And he had done a book about a guy over on Defusky Island, I think, and some school. But anyway, but he basically had written basically crime novels. Very good ones, by the way. I have no idea why they weren't made in the movies. Some really, really clever, some good stuff in there. For some reason, Chuck thought that a novelist who had had a lot of police experience, and he wasn't a policeman, but he had the police beat for 2 Atlanta newspapers. In fact, he said he's the only person that has been or ever will be fired from both Atlanta newspapers because they merged right after the second one fired him. So right now it's just one paper. Anyway, but Coram agreed to do it, and it turned out he was exactly the right person to do it. Being a novelist and a reporter was exactly the right combination to produce the famous Boyd, the Fight Apollo to Change the Art of War. And of course, I'm living there in Atlanta and essentially working for his wife and her PR company. And I'm seeing the various editions of Boyd as they're coming out. You know, as he does a new version, we get together over at the Downwind Cafe at the DeKalb Peachtree Airport. Coram was also a licensed commercial instrument pilot and a lot of flying experience. And so we just hung out there at Peachtree, and he would buy the beer and we'd exchange copies of the manuscript. And so I got to see it develop. And somewhere along there, we got to talking about, you know, he said something like, Janine told me you have his wife told me you started a book on applying this stuff to business. Can I see it? I said, well, sure, it's not going anywhere, but you can see it. So he looked at it, he said, I think this has potential. And that's when he, hooked me up with his agent. We went all through his fall role. But in the meantime, he had put in his book that I was doing this book on applying Boyd's ideas to business, and Boyd's ideas were spreading out beyond the military and all this good stuff. And then his book gets published. And I said, now you got to finish it, because it's in the book. And actually, I started to get contacted by people to give Boyd's briefings. That's how Patterns of Conflict got restarted. And meanwhile, I still hadn't finished the book. So it was Coram who said, why don't you publish it yourself? Forget all these people who don't like the German words. And so that's what I eventually did. The problem with doing a self-published book is you really don't have an editor. You're your own editor. And I'm a strong believer in the thing that there is no such thing as good writing, only good editing. I believe that the writer in the first edition generates a humongous mound of ore, and out of that ore, the editor goes in and finds the nuggets. You can be the same person. And of course, I did a lot of editing in the various drafts, but I had some very good people that did the copy editing on it, that went through after I was ready to send it to the publisher, and they one more edition, and they found 92 typos, misspelled words, doubled words, things like that. And so one of the reasons the book is readable is the people who very generously donated their time, particularly Lane Desborough, to copy edit it and make sure that it was readable. And that was pointed out in 2004. In March 2004, I came down here to Hilton Head and rented a room at what that time was a Residence Inn on the island, and would go run in the morning, write the rest of the day, and then get together with the lady that owned the Airbnb and some of the other people that were living there, and we would drink into the evenings. It was a great way to write. You can't beat that. Put the book, and finally, Mike Wally at that time did his final read through of the book. We incorporated his, his comments. A couple more go arounds with Ex Libris, and the book came out in June 2004. So that's basically how I grew out of a briefing, and 17 years later, let's say 15 years later, was a book.
Wonderful. So if you wanted to describe the book at a very, at a 30,000 foot level, what does the book do?
Well, it's very interesting, and how that came out, because John and I discussed that for a long time. And he said, one of the things is about this is I had, just John talking, I had spent 10 years, 24/7, basically reading everything I could find on a military history, military strategy. I had an office at the Pentagon, if I had a question about a specific battle, I could get out of my chair, go over to the Army, and then, you know, find some people that were experts and may not have fought in that battle, but had done staff rides to the battlefield and knew all about it. And he said, if I wanted to talk physics, you know, at George Washington University's there, Georgetown University's there, you know, plenty of Johns Hopkins right up the road. Freeman Dyson actually stopped by the office and talked with him. He said, you can't do any of that. You know, it's just not. So he said, we got to have a different approach. And the one, I think, and again, I think I suggested this, and he said, I said, rather than focus on the OODA loop itself, the thing that the military and business and sports teams and political campaigns and all that all have in common is they're groups of people that have to operate, for a lack of a better word, harmoniously and smoothly, lack of two better words, under conditions of stress and uncertainty. Where if they don't get it right, maybe they don't all get slaughtered, as can often happen in the military, but you know, they can lose their jobs, they can lose their investment in their companies, and if they're over 40, they can end up permanently unemployed, over 50 at any rate. And so yeah, it can be very, very high. Plus there's this ego thing involved too. So it can be extremely highly stressful. And of course, in Japan, there's expressions for people who commit suicide from overwork. And I don't know how much of that we have here in the U.S. There's the famous thing about, you know, Wall Street crash, people jumping out of buildings. And I don't know if that actually happened or not, but it's a, you know, it's a nice synonym for it. So yeah, there can be a lot of stress in business. People can work themselves, if not to death, they can definitely, as we were talking here, seriously damage their health in a business environment. So we said, well, what enables people to do this in the military? And that's really what John had addressed in Patterns of Conflict, starting with Sun Tzu, and particularly with the Griffith introduction to Sun Tzu. So if people are going to start with one book to really understand Boyd, it would be Samuel B. Griffith's 1963 edition of Sun Tzu's Art of War. And incidentally, they don't have to actually read the Art of War, just read his introduction. It's brilliant. General Griffith was a retired Marine Corps brigadier general. He was highly decorated during World War II. Led the Marine Ranger Battalion during several of the island hopping expeditions, and you know, really knew his stuff from the military, on the ground, boots on the ground Marine. And then when he retired, he went back to Oxford in 1958, I believe it was, got his PhD in 61 in Chinese military history. Now, during his military career, he had been an attaché to China before the war and had kept up his Chinese military studies. So he was very fluent in classical Chinese. And of course, there at Oxford, he had another 3 years to polish on it. So it's a very well done translation that melds not only his knowledge of Chinese military history, but his own war experience and his experience in working directly with the Chinese. And so it's a unique book, but it's his introduction to the book. Because in the introduction of the book, he says in there, Sun Tzu believed that the moral, character, and intellectual capacity of man were decisive. And if you use these to their fullest, victory in war would be certain. You would be, catch the phrase, certain to win, which also comes from the Griffith translation, where Sun Tzu says, generals who follow my method are certain to win, retain them. That's how I got the title. The answer being that you really, in war at least, you really will be certain to win. And it's kind of interesting because the thing in there of know yourself and know the enemy, part of that is know yourself and know the enemy is know when to back off. For example, know when not to go into battle. He says victorious warriors prepare first and win first and then go into battle. And if they can't win, they don't go into battle. You know, they do something else. They retreat, they feint, they do deception, they try to negotiate, you know, but they don't go in and let themselves be destroyed. Mm-hmm. And so we said, gee, I wonder if we could take that sort of thing as our opening into applying Boyd's ideas to business. And that's what we did. And if you look at the layout and all of that in Certain to Win, we talk about strategy, and we talk a little bit about the OODA Loop, pointing out that circular thing has got some severe limits, and talk a little bit about his final formulation of it. Of course, that came out in 90. Actually, he was doodling on in the early 90s. I think I got it in 94 to make a PowerPoint drawing out of it. And it was published in 95 in his last briefing, The Essence of Winning and Losing. But by that time, John was pretty far gone with prostate cancer and was really not participating that much. Uh, but we really said it's that intellectual, moral character and intellectual capacity. And it's not so much IQ points, but it's the ability to keep probing away at a problem until you solve it. To not let yourself essentially take no from nature as an answer. The answer from nature may eventually be no, but the idea is you'll learn enough from probing and testing and banging away at it that you go do something else, and that might be successful. And look at all of building businesses that have been started by people that ended up being successful at something other than what they originally thought it was going to be. You can see the ideas that Boyd's talking about here. So that's really what Certain Win is all based on. Is applying that idea of what makes a successful organization in any competitive sphere successful. And
Wonderful.
So that's in a nutshell.
Wonderful. So I don't know exactly where to start. So I'm going to start. I mean, there are several points I have. So how about starting with the why strategy? So it's like, what is strategy? What is it that you're trying to do? And why do you need strategy itself?
Well, that's a great question. There's a whole cottage industry out there, strategy this, strategy that. When I was trying to get my book sold, I think it was the editor, I think it's a nonfiction business editor or whatever. It wasn't Little Brown, but they're a subsidiary of a much larger. In fact, I think they're a subsidiary now. But anyway, I got to the business guy and he said, well, the average business strategy book sells about 2,500 copies. And I said, that's why they're so expensive. And he said, yeah, but like anything else, we're hoping to get one that sells 100,000 or 200,000. Everybody wants another, in search of excellence. But so he said, what you need to do in the business strategy thing is, he said, you need these hooks. You need to have like questions at the end, things that you can apply, things, how to use this stuff and all that. And I said, all those books that sold 2,500 copies had that stuff in it. Obviously, that is not the answer. I don't know. I guess he knows his business, but it seemed to me that just wasn't going to work. Plus, he didn't like the German words. And, so I got to thinking, and went back and again talked to John about this. And John said, yeah, you're making too much out. He said, strategy and can only be understood when you're comparing it to other forms of endeavor like tactics. And in the military, we throw in one called operations, which he called grand tactics. Then he threw in a couple others, grand strategy. I think he's got even a couple, I think it's like 6 or 7 levels in there. But he said, that's for the military. And he said, even then, you got to argue whether you need all. It's sort of like, how do you fight battles? That's tactics. What do you do between battles? That's operations, operational art. And then why are we fighting all these battles in the first place? That's strategy. So I said, it's just kind of strategy, sort of, what are you trying to do? What are my general parameters? And tactics is, how do you do it? And so I said, that's basically all you need to know. I started thinking about that. I said, all right, well, if that's the case, then there's still some questions you got to ask. For example, if you work for a company that is focused on maintaining a cost advantage, for example, and a lot of companies do. Any company in the so-called commodity business is to some extent competing primarily on cost, and all companies have to compete somehow or another on cost. I mean, for example, we all applaud every time, a SpaceX lands a Falcon 9, even when they don't quite land a Starship. It's still spectacular. We're still, but the reason that Elon Musk's SpaceX is successful is they're a whole bunch cheaper than anybody else for the price of kilogram to orbit. For anything over about 200, I think Rocket Lab may be a little cheaper for real small stuff, but basically they're just really inexpensive and they're reliable. So given the reliability necessary, they're easily the lowest cost producer. At Toyota, the same thing. Toyota doesn't focus on cost in the sense that they look at this and say, well, we could do this cheaper, because that doesn't work. That's a very good way to drive yourself out of business, because you'll make stuff so cheap that it doesn't work, or that the customer begins to appreciate that it's cheap. But the purpose of Toyota is to every year be their cost posture be a little better than it was the year before. And that, I said, the reason for that is in lean times, then they'll survive because they're constantly And in the good times, they'll make a ton of money, which they can then invest. But they're always trying to, wherever there is this, they're always trying to keep the breach. So, but the focus of their system, even though that's what they're trying, the focus of their system is not on cost reduction. That's interesting too. So what is their strategy? Well, turns out their strategy, as they say on the very front page of a manual that they once wrote for their suppliers here in the US, said the purpose of the Toyota production system is to continuously reduce the time between when a customer orders a car and when we deliver it. And remember, all this stuff is basically made to order. It's not quite made to order, but it essentially is. No, they don't inventory a lot of cars and then try to sell from inventory. Obviously, they have some inventory. But what they would like to do is from the time their factory receives an order until the time that order for that car rolls out, they want to continuously reduce that time. Well, how do you do that? Well, you do that by driving out waste. Okay, and guess what? When you drive out waste, your cost goes down. So what they really wanted to prove their cost posture happens as a natural side effect of its deep understanding of what their overall strategy should be, which is driving out waste, which is measured best by time. Time is always in there. And but there's no way to say what's good. It's just whatever you're doing this year, do it better next year. And then just keep doing it and come up with a system that makes that pretty much automatic. And that's the real key to this thing. And in the heart of Certain to Win, in that 4-part climate that he has, the real purpose of that climate is to do that, to continue to set up a system, a climate, a culture where every year you do a little better. And it's top management's function really to ensure that every year you embody that climate a little better than you did the year before. And in a sense, it's easy. Just look at who you promote. A look at who gets the top jobs. Well, do they get the top jobs because they embodied the climate the best, they had the highest moral character, or they get the top jobs because they had the office closest to the president, or because they met quota, somehow or another. How do they get the top job? So don't, like somebody said, tell me you value character, but let me see what you actually do. And so, and oddly enough, it was Jack Welch who I think came up with the best idea on this, which is, kind of a function of a good HR department is to be sort of on the inside and the outside and be able to see if you're actually doing this or not. He called them guardians of the culture, but they can only be guardians of the culture if the people they work for want them to do that. And specifically, not only want them, but actually take actions that make that happen. If you look at military organizations that have successfully used this, obviously the most famous being the Wehrmacht during World War II. As Martin Van Kreveld points out in his book, Fighting Power, they had things that they specifically did to ensure that climate that we talk about in that book was embedded throughout the organization, and to remove the people that didn't seem to quite get the hang of it, to get them out of positions of leadership, whereas they do more damage than good. But it was all based. So the first line of the assessment of any officer was about their character, and then it went on from there. So anyway, I talk a lot, but that's
wonderful. So let me ask a couple of elaborations on that. So you have this entire chapter on the culture of why culture is fundamental, why mutual trust is critical, and what the organizational climate is, whether there is a sense of mission, what is the morale, where it's leadership, you have kind of harmony between people, so you stress heavily on the criticalness of the climate, the organizational climate, which serves as the backdrop or the kind of the implicit operating system, because it's both kind of implicit and explicit, right?
Definitely both. Yes, that's an implicit and explicit character. Well, look, Shrikant, a company is people. They own equipment and they occupy buildings and they write manuals and things, but the company is people. And if you don't accept that, then that's fine, but we don't really have more to talk about. But if you accept that the company is people working together, then all you've really got is the culture. By definition, the culture is how the people work together, both implicitly and explicitly. And so the question then becomes, well, what kind of culture do you want? And my answer to that was, you want a culture, whatever it is, that basically encourages, like the expression, stokes up the creativity and initiative throughout the organization and harmonizes it to accomplish the objectives of the organization, whatever they might be. The function of course, senior leadership is to help determine those objectives, but also to put into place the climate and culture that makes that harmonization not only possible, but virtually makes it automatic. And it's definitely not easy, but it's not impossible either, as a number of successful companies have shown, Toyota just probably being the best known. And what's interesting is when they started having their problems back in the early 2000s, you may remember the incident where the CEO of Toyota had to bow and apologize for the problems they were having, and where Consumer Reports temporarily dropped them from the list of recommended corporations. Some of their models they continued to recommend, but the corporation at all. It was because they had put their focus on growth. They had established an artificial target. They wanted to make 10 million vehicles a year. Where did that come from? I mean, who cares? The question should be more like, is our quality improving every year? Is our bottom line improving every year? Or is our retention improving every year? That's what they should worry about. And the cars, the numbers, and all that will fall out where they fall out, because somebody's got to design and build the cars, and that's the people. And so that's what you got to work on. If your quality is not good, then why are people building mistakes and letting them get through?
Yep.
That's the problem you need to solve.
Let me take a moment to talk about, you have this amazing definition from John Boyd of strategy. So it says, strategy is the mental tapestry of changing intentions for harmonizing and focusing our efforts as a basis for realizing some aim or purpose in an unfolding and often unforeseen world of many bewildering events and many contending interests.
That's what happens when you try to write too much on the back of napkins at happy hour. You come up with definitions like that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the idea is very, very interesting. I don't know whether you accept it or not, but there might be some nuggets in there. For example, in Boyd's world, a plan is an intention. A schedule is a little more specific intention, but a plan is just an intention. It may or may not happen. That's famous observation of the elder von Moltke, German field marshal, right after in fact, led the wars that led to the unification of Germany in the mid-1800s. He famously saying, no plan survives first contact with the enemy, but without plans, you're very unlikely to succeed. Well, given that your first plan didn't survive first contact with the enemy, then what? You just, all right, everybody for themselves, charge the enemy. Well, there are times when that actually worked. But for the most part, with modern firepower and things like that, probably not a good idea. So what you need, if your first plan doesn't work, you need a second plan or a third plan or some other way to continue the action even after your first plan broke down. And the mechanism by which you construct either more plans or you seize control of the current situation, the present moment, that sort of thing, that's strategy. And so your strategy is your framework, or as he called it, your that tapestry of changing intentions, which I like it. To me, it sort of conjures up the visions in Nordic mythology of the three Norns at the root or the base of the great tree of the Yggdrasil, that weaving the fates of men back and forth. And John certainly did not believe in fate, but the idea is I think very poetic. And he called it tapestry because all this planning and stuff that we do has to fit together, has to work together for a harmonious whole in order to accomplish some goal. So if you have a good strategy, even if your plans break down, as long as everybody has imbued what our strategy is, they should be able to come up with new plans on their own that harmonize with that strategy. and communicate back to the senior to the senior leaders. Well, if that's the way that you want it to happen, then you ought to go ahead and train for that, and you plan for that, and rehearse that, and do your war games for that, and all of that. And if that's what you want to happen, then you need to promote people who can actually do it. And that is one of the things that at least a small part of the German army was able to do between the war. And they were able to do it because they had had the good fortune to lose World War I. And that meant that they only had 100,000 people in their military. That was everybody, Kriegsmarine, Navy, Luftwaffe, the whole bit. And which meant that they couldn't have any tanks, and they couldn't have any combat aircraft. So they didn't have a big defense procurement, military industrial complex to worry about. And so it was basically just stripped down to the core of people that wanted to be in the military and had experienced World War I. Now, right at the end of World War I, the Germans experimented with what later became the Blitzkrieg and their spring offensive, March of 1918. And it succeeded tactically, but failed strategically. And the reason was it essentially ran out of steam. They drove in faster than they could support, and it just sort of bogged down. The French were able to get out in front of them. But tactically, it went much further than any other German offense in the entire war, except for the very first one that almost made it to Paris. After that, once the lines got there after the Battle of the Marne, once the lines solidified, they didn't move more than about 7 or 8 miles, basically the whole rest of the war, until the spring offensive that used what we might call prototype Blitzkrieg tactics. And so the Germans thought about this.
No, sorry, go ahead.
Okay, they thought about this, and they put in they essentially went back to what they had worked from the time of their defeat by Napoleon all the way on up, and they thought about their war college, which they're no longer allowed to have, the General Staff College, and they sort of put it all together, and they came up with ways of selecting and promoting people. Since they didn't need very many, it was very easy to be very selective. German economy was really bad, so they had a lot of people wanting to. They could be very selective about promoting and retaining people, and that's why they were able to carry out these ideas, because they're not necessarily easy to carry out. Like somebody said, you got to be willing to fire your friends and relatives. So
let me ask you, you have this very great summary of the key attributes of the Blitzkrieg.
Yeah.
Those 4, I will not try to pronounce those words.
Pronounced pretty much like they look. There were actually 5, but John said, don't try to confuse them with agility. We'll do a separate chapter on agility, and they won't realize that that's really the fifth one, the Hindigkeit. Otherwise, they pretty much sound like they look. Unlike, for example, people, and I won't mention any names, Dave Snowden, but people who think up names in Welsh in some Celtic term to describe them. These pretty much describe them the way they look. You'll be very close. So, okay. For example, it doesn't make a difference which one you start at. Floyd started with Einheit, and which makes sense because if you don't have mutual trust, then the rest of it's not going to work at all. However, in like thinking about like Toyota with cost, where you want to get to is an improving cost picture, but you don't start with that. You got to be a little more subtle. You got to finesse the system. So what I generally do when I'm talking to people, I start with Fingerspitzengefühl. That UE, the umlaut over the thing, just pronounce it like it was a U and don't worry about it. Fingerspitzengefühl, fingertip feeling. Nice thing about English being a Germanic language is a lot of the words pretty much fingertip feeling. Everybody gets really good at what they're doing. Whatever it is they're supposed to be doing, they get really good at it. They develop self-esteem. Toyota, for example, if you would promote you up in engineering management, you've got to be widely appreciated within Toyota as an engineer. And then of their really good engineers, then they'll look around to try them out in various leadership jobs. And eventually they can lead an automotive development team, for example. But first, they got to be really good engineers. So they certainly don't set with the idea that you can teach anybody to lead. That might be true given that they already are functionally quite good at what they do. One thing is, otherwise people won't pay attention to they won't speak with any moral force. So everybody works on the Fingerspitzengefühl for a variety of reasons. If you're really good at what they're doing. Turns out that's only level 1 definition of Fingerspitzengefühl, but it'll do for us for now. Now, what that means is that people can do the stuff that they do so well that it looks like magic to an outsider. And they can work together in their teams with other people so well that it looks like magic to an outsider, that it looks like they're actually reading each other's minds. And in a sense, essentially, that's a phrase the Marine Corps uses in their MCDP-1, their warfighting manual, which you can download off the internet. Just Google warfighting and you'll find it. And that's how they describe it. We get to work together so well that it's as if we could read each other's minds. Well, when you get to where you can read each other's minds, you don't have to waste a lot of time passing communications back and forth, particularly written communications, which, as John said, is basically for CYA purposes, because not enough time. Now, I think he was wrong on that to an extent. We'll talk about that in a minute, but he's certainly right on it in the idea that issuing written orders in a very time-sensitive endeavor is going to slow you down. But anyway, much better to do it implicitly. So that's Einheit. The German word ein, maybe ein, zwei, drei, you're probably familiar with that, means one. And height is an attribute that turns adjectives into a noun, like oneness, for example. And if you look it up in Google, it'll say unit, like a military unit. John translated it as mutual trust. It could also have the connotation of cohesion, for example. It has the connotation of that force that gets people to come up out of the trenches and walk into machine guns, knowing most of them are going to die. Not just the German army in World War I, in the American Civil War, there were a number of instances. People would take their names on the back of their uniform so their body could be identified. It's just incredible. We just can't imagine that nowadays. But if you Google Cold Harbor and read the Wikipedia description of it, that's one of the battles where it happened. But what's the force then that gets people to do that? That's that cohesion, that not willing to let your peers, your friends, your compadres down. And it's an incredibly powerful force. And to me, it just amazes me the way that so few companies are really willing to harness even a tiny bit of it. And that was the big objection to the classical way that matrix management is done. Is it's virtually impossible to get that level of cohesion done because you're trying to serve two masters at once, and you're on this team, you're on that team, you're on that. Turns out there are ways to make it work, but you have to basically train for it. Toyota, for example, uses a form of matrix management, but they do it in a very subtle way. Teams will stay together, teams will work together, they'll come back and work together on different projects. They really get to know each other very, very well. And so they can develop a lot of this Einheit. Most companies aren't willing to do that. Plus, they train incessantly. Just to even get hired by Toyota, at least back before they got this obsession with growth, was really hard to do. You had to spend, I mean, it was a 10-week course that you had to go through on your own, typically taught at community colleges. And once you pass that, then Toyota might select you to come into their training program. Once you pass that, then you were eligible to get selected to actually go out on the floor as an apprentice. So people that came out on the floor were not only very well trained, they were very highly motivated. They're like people coming out of Marine Corps basic training. If you ever get the chance to do that, come down here to Paris Island and watch a Marine Corps graduation ceremony. You can see how proud and psyched these people are to be in the Marine Corps, even though they haven't fired a bullet in anger at anybody yet, but they are Marines. They wear the Eagle Globe and anchor. And so that's what we're talking about with Einheit. We got Fingerspitzengefühl, we got Einheit. Boyd pointed out that once an organization has Einheit, it works together as a unified whole, and to an outsider, the famous man from Mars, it will look like it has Fingerspitzengefühl. Cool. Let's think about that one for a while. All right. One of the things that is interesting about Einheit, this unity, this cohesion thing, is that everybody has a common picture of what we're trying to accomplish and the basic rules for how we're trying to do it. So, for example, with Toyota, it's a constantly, reduce the time it takes to do things, drive out waste. And you can't reduce that by building inventory. That's not work in process inventory is evil, not because it's expensive, but because it clouds your orientation of what's actually going on. And so, because you can use this excess inventory to cloud the fact that you have a lousy system. You just go through and find the good parts and then go on. You don't realize how bad your system really is. So everybody understands that at TWID. Everybody understands in the Marine Corps the basics of the Marine Corps strategy of not, hey, diddle little right up in the middle. We'll engage the enemy and then we'll try to find ways around it, what they call surfaces and gaps and that sort. So they're all familiar with that basic idea. And so they know the basic doctrine. And to me, I think that has to be written down. Boyd didn't necessarily agree. He said doctrine on day one, dogma on day two, and he may well have been right. Marines haven't updated their doctrine since 1997. But I think you do need to write some stuff down. I really, Toyota, again, very strong on that. They call it standardized work. It just says, based on what we know right now, this is the best way to do it. Our focus is on improving it. But this documents what we think right now is our best idea how to do it. And we're always, and we wrote the standard work document ourselves, not some IE that was sent down from above or from a consultant. We worked this system, and this is how we think it ought to work. So that's part of Einheit. And the idea being, as John said, once you have this common outlook and everybody knows what it is we're trying to accomplish, and everybody knows basically how we're going to try to accomplish it, then you can start backing off and start letting people use their creativity and initiative then on the how to accomplish it part, because they're not going to be herding cats. They know what we're trying to do and they know how to do it. And so you can give them a lot of initiative and still accomplish the purposes of the organization. Einheit, it's wonderful.
Wonderful. So what are the remaining two? So we've covered two in detail.
Okay, you can almost stop with Einheit, actually. Boyd said that a lot. However, it's become fashionable, at least, to, and been several books recently written on it, to take it a little bit further. The next one that usually comes up is sometimes called mission command, mission control. John called it the German concept of mission. The German word that's usually used is Auftragstaktik. Like so many words, it was initially derogatory, but later on became how it's usually described. If you put Auftrag into Google Translate, you'll probably find the first meaning is something like contract, because it has the connotation of a contract between a superior and a subordinate. And I should point out, Boyd, coming from a military background, very much is in the superior subordinate model. Self-organizing teams and that sort of thing. I mean, he never said they wouldn't work, but it's not something he really considered. But even there, these ideas, somebody's still got to have the basic idea of what we're going to do next, whether that person is a team leader or just somebody with a bright idea and then they vote on it, makes no difference. Once you decide what you're going to do, then that cohesion comes in. So with Auftragstaktik, and we'll do superior and subordinate, you're allowed to do a little bit of shaping. Say, okay, you know what we're trying to do, and you understand all the but here's exactly what I want you to do in this particular operation. So in other words, he says, all right, I want you to, for example, keep the enemy to the west of the river for at least 8 hours, because just keep them out. I don't care how many I keep them west, keep them away from me for 8 hours. And so that's your mission. And you say, well, I can do that, but I'm going to need some artillery support, because, I'm missing a mortar platoon and I'm down a couple of my armored vehicles. So the commander says, well, I don't have as much artillery as I would like, but I'll tell you what, I'm owed some sorties from the Air Force. So I'll give you X amount of artillery that I have, so many firing, opportunities that you have that you can go on the network. And I'm going to give you 200 sorties of close air support. And of course, you have a forward observer from the Air Force. And now can you do it? And the guy says, yes, sir, I can do it. Right. Once he says, yes, sir, I can do it, and salute, shakes hands, whatever they're going to do, bumps elbows nowadays. The commander then goes off and worries about other things. As Boyd said, the commander has every right, once agreement has been reached, to believe that the mission will be carried out to the last man, if that's necessary, until either the mission is relieved or everybody's dead, one of the two. Or there is a third one here, or it becomes clear to the person on the ground that the scene has changed and he doesn't have orders yet, or maybe ever, but he understands that things have changed now and takes the initiative to do something different. Now, he has to communicate all this stuff back. A lot of things that is forgotten in Auftragstaktik is I'm communicating back to my superior all the time. Very, very minimal communications. I'm here, things are good, things are bad, I'm holding on, I'm down to 50%. I'm down to 25%, whatever. And you say, there's nobody in front of me. The enemy is pulling back and running away. I'm going to continue to engage. And he sends that back. You may get one right back saying, no, it's a trap. Don't do it. However, go around to your left, hold the enemy there in front of you, go around to your left. Things like that can get passed on. But the idea is you reach a contract between the superior and subordinate. That contract is to be carried out regardless, but there's communication back all the time from the subordinate to the superior, very, very minimal, so that the superior's Fingerspitzengefühl, his Einheit, his overall picture of the battle can be maintained. That's how Auftrag work, Auftragstaktik. And they say, well, that's pretty logical. What's the opposite of Auftragstaktik? Well, opposite of an Auftrag is a Befehl, as a general rule. You got to be a little careful as you try to look the words up in Google. It doesn't quite work, but to the German military thing, that's what they told Boyd it was. A Befehl is a directive. It's like what you do on a parade ground, left face. You're not interested in people taking the initiative in a parade ground where you're putting on a parade. You weren't interested back in linear tactics of the type that, for example, Clausewitz was writing about. Initiative was at the very high level, the commander level, the corps commander level, down maybe at the unit level. When you got down to the person on the battlefield, you were not interested in initiative. You were interested in them going through that drill, over and over again on command, not worrying about people were dying on both sides. You sit there and you went through this, however many step drill you had, loaded, fired, back, boom, shoot, 2 steps forward, boom, boom, load, fire. And that's all you were interested in, volume of fire going out. And as Frederick the Great said, you made your soldiers more afraid of their own officers than they were of the enemy, and everything tended to work fine. Incidentally, the Duke of Wellington did not subscribe to that. And neither really did Napoleon, by the way. Anyway, so that's Auftragstaktik.
And the fourth?
Okay, fourth is Schwerpunkt. Yep. Punkt is point. See, dramatic language, it all comes out. Schwer can mean either hard or difficult. Clausewitz translated it as center of gravity. Boyd translated it as focus and direction, or focus of main effort. Now, it's interesting, main effort does not mean, and rarely ever meant, the largest unit or the most firepower. See, if it's misapplied, like it was in World War I, quite often, it was applied as where we're going to put the heaviest firepower. So for example, at the Battle of the Somme, July 1st, July 1st, 1916. Got to get it right here. Known as the Black Day of the British Army, because on that day, the British Army came out of their trenches at the Battle of the Somme and walked into prepared German defenses and lost 20,000 men in not much over an hour. The reason they lost so many men is that they had an artillery preparation that lasted about a week. They fired over 1 million rounds. Well, if you're the Germans and all of a sudden this sector opens up and 1 million rounds come raining down on you, see if you can guess where the attack is going to be. Well, defenses back then weren't just one line of trenches. They were multiple lines of trenches. And then back behind them was another set of multiple lines. And then there were roads going back and forth where they could move artillery and where they could shift reinforcements. And so maybe the artillery took out the first line, and that's okay. The second and third, I chewed up a lot of barbed wire. It also made the terrain very uneven, which made it very difficult to maintain this nice parade ground order. But even there, what they had discovered by 1916 is you didn't just have trenches, you dug fortifications down in the ground. When the artillery barrage started, you went down into your fortifications. Maybe the artillery got some of them or buried some of them, but a lot of them survived. As soon as the barrage was lifted, they came back out with their machine guns and they waited for you to come through the haze and the smoke, and they mowed you down. And but they were coming against, they were throwing force against what they saw as a center of gravity, and or a classical Schwerpunkt. But technology had advanced so far since the time of Clausewitz that interpretation of Clausewitz, which, by the way, if you go back and read him very carefully, is not really what he was talking about. It was much more of a mental thing, much more of a kind of a Sun Tzu thing than how his disciples in World War I were giving him credit for. But that became, so the Schwerpunkt, then the Germans then looked at it and said, well, it's really kind of a concept that everything else has to support. And in the military, it's often assigned to a unit. So for example, to give a simple one, in the invasion of France, most of the force was up in the north where it had been during World War I. However, they had a one army group down to the south, a very small, I think it was just 9 divisions in that group, and there were a couple more up on the top. Very small amount of force, and its function was to punch through the Ardennes, cross the river at Sedan, and circle around back behind the French and the British. And they knew that the French and British plan was, once the war started, they were going to rush forward into Belgium. They were going to meet the German attack in Belgium. So if they got pushed back, the trench lines formed in Belgium and not in France. The French having learned their lesson in World War I. It's not clear what the Belgians thought about this. I'm not sure they even bothered to ask. Because that's what happened in World War I, the Schlieffen Plan came around that time. So in World War II, same thing. The Germans feinted to the north, a huge amount of force. It sucked the bulk of the French and German force up to the north, whereas the main German effort, which was actually a fairly small thing, the Schwerpunkt, the thing that all this stuff up here was just to allow this group down here to penetrate. And that's what happened. And it wasn't that the French didn't think you could take tanks through the Ardennes, through the forest. Yeah, it was pretty forested and it was pretty narrow trails. And yeah, it was really tough getting forces through, but the Germans rehearsed that because the French knew exactly what the Ardennes looked like. That wasn't a problem. What they said is they couldn't bring up enough firepower to be able to cross the river at Sedan. We can hold them up. They actually had units there on the river to hold up the Germans. What they didn't count on was 2 things: the rapidity of the German advance, because they had practiced this going through. And even though they had a lot of problems, they still came through much faster than the French thought. And they had the Stuka. They had flying artillery. They gave them enough firepower right on the banks to be able to cross the river. And the guy who led the initial cross was a guy named Hermann Balk, who Boyd then interviewed in 1979. So that's Schwerpunkt. Schwerpunkt is any concept that everything else has to support. You see, it harmonizes a group of people, whereas Auftragtaktik really puts one person into the picture.
Excellent. Excellent. So I want to hit just one more area before I open it up for questions. Would you like to take a break now, or would you like to take a break?
Let's go ahead and hit the last area here.
Okay. So the last area, which is a huge thing for me, that's the thing I find most fascinating about this, is that you use Chinese concepts like Cheng and Qi, yin and yang, and integrate it into this narrative. So how do these Chinese concepts do this?
I'm almost embarrassed to even talk about it because I know so little. On the other hand, it's an enormous subject. It all goes back to Sun Tzu, probably the easiest way to say it. A lot of debate. Was there actually a person named Sun Tzu? The name literally means master son, as I understand it. And there was a Sun Ping, who was his descendant. But was there an individual named Sun Tzu? A lot of debate. There may have been a guy who started it and then other people glommed on, added stuff on. That's a possibility. It doesn't really make any difference. The work is definitely old. There have been copies of it found that date to sometime before the turn of the 0th millennium, the first, when it was over 2,000 years old. The famous Linyi text written on bamboo survived because I guess it was very dry. And they're very close to the Sun Tzu book that we have today. So at least by that time, the Sun Tzu text was there and was widely studied. But there was a lot going on in 400 or 500 BC. About that same time, Gautama Siddhartha, who later became known as the Buddha, the enlightened one, was teaching in northern India, southern Nepal, that area up in there. And his teachings were coming out particularly a couple hundred years later with the Mayuran Empire and Ashoka. And so those ideas, and there was a lot of traffic between China and India, both over the Silk Road in the north and through the sea passages around the south. Excuse me here. And you see a lot of similar ideas being passed around. They both had the concept to some extent of the way itself, Dao being, of course, the Chinese term, pronounced many different ways depending on the dialect, but the idea of bringing yourself in harmony and acting in harmony and developing deep understanding of concepts and acting in harmony with them. The concept of Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, and in Indian philosophy, which go way back before the Buddha. I mean, the Hindus today regard the Buddha as kind of a reformist, and kind of one sort of a branch, kind of sort of like maybe the Catholics regard the Protestants, sort of thing. But definitely one of them, definitely in that stream. But there are other Indian schools that teach very similar things. Vedanta, for example, today that are studied in India. So these ideas go way, 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 way back. And the kind of warfare that they describe, oddly enough, seem very, very applicable to the kind of warfare that was waged once technology started raising its ugly head in the West. And that was about the middle of the 19th century with the invention of such things as the mini ball, which, you see, they had rifles. They had rifles almost in the very beginning. The problem with the rifle was it took a long time to load. Because you had to ram this ball. It was a ball just like a musket ball. You had to ram it down inside these grooves. And a really, really good rifleman could get about 2 rounds a minute off. A really good smooth bore musketeer could get 4 rounds a minute off. Napoleon abolished the rifle because he wanted that high rate of fire. However, about in the middle of the early 1830, 1835 or so, a French guy invented the mini ball, and metallurgy had developed to the point where both the barrels could be made stronger, but also they had this little lead thingy where it wasn't shaped like a ball. It was, if you're familiar with the mini ball, it was a cone, had a point on the end, but the back end of it was hollow. And when the powder was set off, since that back end was lead, the heat forced the lead up into the grooves, which then gave you the rotation. So instead of having essentially a knuckleball, I'm familiar with baseball, coming out the front end of the barrel, you had a rifle shot coming out of the front end of the barrel. So the effective range went from about 70 yards, to kill anything within 70 yards, to about 200 yards. Yeah, or maybe even more. Now, what this meant was interesting. If you do some math, at about 70 yards, how long does it take somebody to run 70 yards? In full pack, if they're very, very highly motivated? I don't know, 10, 15 seconds maybe. Let's say 15 seconds. Let's say 20 seconds even, which is about a third of a minute. So if you march up to about 70 yards, you fire around with your smoothbore musket, you fix your bayonet very quickly. You probably didn't have it on before because it's very difficult to reload the rifle with a knife blade sticking out the front of it. You fix your muskets, you lower it, and you charge. And you can cover that, even if you're not running, you can probably cover that at a fast pace, cover that distance 35. So the enemy will get one more shot at you, and after that, you're on top of them. And that's the tactics that particularly the British used under Wellington in particular, both in India, in Peninsula, and to some extent at Waterloo. Napoleon used slightly different tactics, but that was the basic idea, is you could fire and then you could cover the distance between you and the enemy before the enemy could get more than about one more shot at you. If you do that same mathematics at 200 yards, it just doesn't work. At 200 yards, they just get too many shots at you. And even though a lot of the people weren't firing for religious reasons, some people just didn't fire. Even in the South, they found a lot of people would aim above rather than shoot to kill. Thou shalt not kill. They would aim, above, and wasn't as many as SLA Marshall might have led you to believe, but it was still a fair number of people just didn't want to kill even in war. But even with that, it made the charge, the linear tactics that had worked so well for so many people up to that time, made them suicidal by the time of the American Civil War, and by the time of the First World War, suicidal. I mean, they just weren't legitimate tactics. We can talk about why generals kept doing it, but that's a different question.
Sure. Let me ask specifically about these concepts of Cheng and Chi.
All right, now, so you get into, well, so what are you going to do? How do you break out of this? And what they did was they came up with these maneuver tactics. And one of the elements of maneuver tactics was you don't go charging right into things, as a general rule. What you want to do in maneuver tactics is you want to get the enemy's attention, perhaps by advance or even a short artillery barrage or something like that. And while his attention is fixed, you want to do something else. Chang is according with what his intentions are, and Chi is doing something else.
Mhm.
So it's the expected and the unexpected. The trick is to make this work, you've got to be able to read the other guy's mind. Well, how do you do that? Well, partly you can read his mind by studying his doctrine and his training and observing him in action. But part of it is you can shape his intentions through things like a multiple thrust. You come at him 3 or 4 different places. And a couple of things. If one of them gets blocked, you got 2 others to go, but also he had no idea which, and those 3, when they get up close to the line, they split or even down into maybe squad level. So what he sees, instead of one thing coming at him, he sees opportunistic things of people coming towards it. An idea being primarily to grab his attention so that then you can send your main attack where he doesn't expect. Straight out of Sun Tzu, Chang Chi. There's a lot more. That chapter where Chang Chi comes out, I think it's chapter 5, called Energy, is all about a concept called Shir, S-H-I-H. I think it's, they said it's kind of pronounced like S-H-I-R, and I can't help you very much with Chinese pronunciations. But David Lai wrote a great book on Chinese strategy. I think it's out of some of my briefings. Something the stone strategy of it's David L-A-I. If you search on L-A-I and stones, S-T-O-N-E-S, you'll find it. A very good introduction to this concept, and of which Chang Chi is just one. Another one is essentially building up your strength while you probe and test the enemy. And you get that like, the game of Go, where you're playing. A lot of that playing is trying to get position before anything. I don't play Go, but I kind of got it. And very much like we said what Toyota did, constantly building your competitive position, and not doing bet the farm kind of stuff. Make sure that you are certain to win when you actually do act, that sort of thing. Those concepts go all the way back to Sun Tzu, and undoubtedly go way back before him. It's just the oldest. And for the kind of stuff that they were doing, which is pretty mobile warfare, chariots were involved. They were big into archery. They were big into things like catapults, that sort of thing. They did a lot of maneuvering around, which Western armies weren't doing. And I think when the Western armies went back then and trying to find ways out of the stalemate they'd gotten into, Sun Tzu was a natural. And if you look, his ideas were, of course, picked up by the Japanese during their warring states period, particularly that period, before the establishment of the Tokugawa shogunate in about 1603 or so. The series of battles, the three warlords ending in Ieyasu Tokugawa, who unified Japan. If you look at those battles, they were fought heavily by Sun Tzu, but also interestingly enough, they were the first battles where, at least in Japan, where firepower, where gunpowder played a decisive role. But anyway, they continued on it, and after Japan was unified and all warfare inside Japan was eliminated, they still had the samurai, who were basically like old West gunfighters. They were allowed to go around as long as they fought each other. It was kind of entertainment and such things. And they added their own kind of twist to these with a much more of a Buddhist, a Zen flavor, particularly the idea of not letting your mind stick. And the idea of the mind that does not stick being very key to sword fighting. And that's, I think, even though Boyd had talked about implicit, that's where he got the idea of the implicit guidance and control feed from orientation. Another nice Zen idea, straight to action. This idea of keeping, even if it's unconsciously, keeping your mind focused on the present moment and constantly coming up with possibilities of opportunities for action. And then at some point, you'll get the idea of triggering it, and then you just do it. And as you're doing it, you're observing the effects, and your mind is predicting that what's going to happen next. And then you keep this tempo going at a very rapid pace. I think those are ideas that we got more from Zen. And so Boyd essentially followed the Germans, who were familiar with both of them. I mean, Buddhism had been in Europe for a long time at this point. And the Germans, particularly the Nazis, were fascinated. That's where they got the swastika symbol for. And Himmler had a whole division that was prowling around Central Asia trying to find the Aryan roots of the German people. And so they were familiar with a lot of these ideas. And so they incorporated a lot of that into their maneuver warfare philosophy that became the Blitzkrieg, and it's continued on to this day. So there were ideas in there that they found very, very useful to break out of the stalemate that attrition warfare had gotten into thanks to the rise of technology. That's sort of my simple-minded version of it.
All right, folks, let's get started with questions. So let's see. It's going to be David, E, Christian, Rupali, and Aaron next.
Lord,
David.
So many questions.
Yeah, thanks very much. Wonderful presentation, and great to hear all this detail. You discussed a lot about the allies and how the team should approach cohesion to work against the enemy. In your book, you described a little bit about how to exploit chaos in the enemy. And so I'm wondering if you could expand on that a little bit more about how to leverage and address the enemy as in contrast with the operations of the company or the team or the group.
All right, let me share my screen here. I'll come right back. Turns out I have a chart, I think, that talks about that very, very quickly. And it might be a little different in war than it is in business. And the reason I say this, for one thing, is in war, we talked about you really can only have one Schwerpunkt, one main effort at a time. Whereas it's not necessarily true in business. The trick is that you don't want them to trade off. You can't have multiple Schwerpunkts if by improving one, you degrade the other. So let me go back now. I think we're ready. I'll be right with you. So this will give us an idea. Let me play this. All right, this is Boyd's impression of Blitzkrieg tactics. This is the military now, but I think it'll give the idea. Blitz, lightning, see, get it? A couple things to notice here. First is there's more than one. So I said if one of them gets blocked, the other two may succeed. Another thing to notice is there's probably, you got to keep that center one deconflicted from the one on the right, because friendly fire is a huge problem. So there's probably a river that they haven't drawn running down through the middle here somewhere along in there. And Boyd said multiple thrusts, and even once it gets out, what you don't see down on the bottom here is instead of one arrow, there's probably a whole bunch of them coming in here. But look at these points. The points out here, they're doing a couple of things. These areas in between are probably enemy concentrations that they're going around, that they're bypassing. And part of the unit will probably stay engaged with them to fix them in place, while follow-on units engage them and either accept their surrender or enter into battle with them. But look at these arrow points. They're clearly being very opportunistic. And say there's no way to map out beforehand where all these arrow points are going to go. For one thing, because you don't know what the enemy's going to be doing while all this is going along. So this guy right here came to here and probably found that there was a unit in this area. So rather than charge into it, he left a few forces to hold them in place and then zagged in another direction, because he knew the whole purpose of the whole organization, that Einheit thing, overall was probably a kettle battle. These two guys on the side are going to link up somewhere in here. This guy right here, his Auftrag, the commander, has been told your job is to drive in here and engage as many enemy units as you can and fix them in place so that these two Pincer units around the side can penetrate more easily. And he's probably told one or the other of them that if things bog down, you're the main one, or I'll designate one of you two, because you really don't need two of them. All you really need is one of them to penetrate and come around over on the side. but see, everybody understands that. So these little guys down here are zigging and zagging all in concert with the overall plan that has come out. And so the function of sort of the overall commander is to maintain this feeling about whether or not the battle is going in the right direction. And by the way, the real meaning of Fingerspitzengefühl is to be able to sense patterns out of chaos. Everybody else sees chaos, but you sense the actual pattern that's there and are able to exploit it. It was most famously applied to Rommel. Rommel had this Fingerspitzengefühl, and he would make orders that just seemed like they were totally suicidal and ridiculous to his subordinates, but turned out to be brilliant in the end. Let's look here just a second, and let's see. I've stopped the share before I can get out of this. Hold on just a second. I'll be right back. Don't go away.
Sure.
I'm gonna find. You can never find these things when you need them. You ever notice that? Ah, there it is. Wait a minute. I have to get out. The way this works, I have to get out. Come back. Share again. Sorry, because I'm using the play function. That's not. Dang it! Hold on just a minute. Go back. You can go back. Excuse me just a second. I got the wrong one here. Now let's try it. There we go. Y'all see that?
Yep.
All right. We've talked. The top one there is the overall Schwerpunkt of the Toyota production system. So everybody working in the system through their training programs that we talked about a little bit understands this and understands what it means. And it particularly says you don't do something to save money if it would take more time. And in particular, if by taking more time means we have to stop and inspect it more. Remember, they have the concept of stopping the line in the Toyota system and the andon, the light that comes on. And of course, that drags out time. So if you're going to do something that's going to shorten the time, basically it's got to drive out waste. And if you're familiar with Toyota, you know that they make an absolute science of waste. You know, 3 different forms: Muri, Muron, Muda, and all that kind of good stuff. But they really study it and they think about it. And everybody in the system, at least in theory, when it was working as it was supposed to, really understood it. Go down to the bottom one down there, the third one, Kanban. Y'all are probably familiar with Kanban, the card that uses that operates the just-in-time or the pull system within Toyota. But they're the key. This is what Toyota says about it. There is no centralized production control as there was at Lockheed, sending orders down to every part of the factory, telling them what to do next. In the Kanban system, they know how many of these they're going to build, of what color, what configuration, and that flows down. We need so many of these. That flows down. We know so many of these sub-assemblies and so many of these parts, and all the way on down to the shop that's actually drilling holes in sheet metal. But that's all run by this pull system, this card system, run by the people on the factory floor. So but they know their real Schwerpunkt is not just to run it so much, is to figure out ways to improve it, figure out ways to pull waste out of that system, even today, in keeping with the top level. Now, the one in the middle there is from Jeffrey Licker's book on the Toyota Way, came out several years ago. It's still a very good book. And there he's talking about Einheit again, thinking about how to teach and reinforce the value system. I say they got away from that, and it bit them in the early 2000s. I think under Akio Toyota, family member who is now running it, they've tried to get back to that a lot more. It's a very interesting thing. If that's your focus, then you still measure. You still do an awful lot of measurement. Toyota does an awful lot of measurements, but they recognize that the measurements are outputs rather than they tell you how well the system is doing. It would be like if you're trying to run the thing based on the numbers alone, it'd be like trying to make your car go faster by reaching up and taking the speedometer and pulling it over. Now, the trick is the value system there, how to teach, how to reinforce it, how to get everybody doing better at what they're doing, and how to understand that that's really what's going on. So this maybe give you a little bit of an example of how you can use some of this stuff out in the boonies here. Let me stop share. I can do it. Can we stop share here? Oops.
It's done.
There we go. Yay! Thank you. I'll go
Wonderful.
back. Zoom then.
Thank
and
you.
Here we are. Yeah, and there are other things that you can think of too. Obviously, agility, Bekendigkeit. Really good example of that, although it didn't turn out maybe that awfully well in the end, or maybe it did. I'm not sure. Was Nokia? You may remember back before the iPhone, back before this guy, Nokia ruled the world. And they really did. They owned the cellular phone business, but that wasn't how they started out. Nokia started out as a forest products company, selling paper, selling wood pulp, that sort of thing.
So Chet, can we go to the next question? We've got Yen, Christian, Rupali, Aaron, Mike, John, Tom, and Madeline waiting in line.
Right along. I'll try to be more brief. Go ahead.
So next is my friend Yen, who flew as a weapons system officer. Yen.
Hi, thank you. I have a question concerning the in the business world of managing the change management within the team, especially when they're in remote locations, but without stifling the initiative and creativity. How do you frame and train and the orders and guidances to be able to allow that? And it's mainly a communication question, so that you take advantage of the iterations.
No, it's an excellent question. And I think we're still trying to figure that out to some extent. The ability to give people initiative, allow them to use their creativity, depends heavily on what Boyd called the common outlook, the Einheit, the overall understanding of what we're trying to do. Because obviously, if people are working remotely, there's a limit to how much looking over their shoulder how much micromanaging you can do. You can do a surprising amount of it, but not nearly as much as you could back in the in the physical world. So I think first it's going to take more training. As the pandemic perhaps loosens up some, more people get vaccinated, we have perhaps some more effective treatments of it, then I think it is going to be necessary for people to perhaps physically get together, to some extent, in order for them to be able to work remotely more effectively on their own. Now, Boyd used to say that the stuff about Auftragstaktik and all that, it sounds good, but there are some people you're not going to be able to use it with. They just are not going to get it. You can still use them. You can still make them productive members of your organization, but you are going to have to give them more specific things to do, and you're going to have to watch them more closely, at least initially. As long as you understand that, it can still work. What you don't want to do is try to manage somebody by Auftragstaktik who is just not ready for it yet. There's so many examples of that. But when that happens, when they go off and do something that impresses you as really dumb, that's really, in a sense, it's a leadership failure and should be regarded as that. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but I think we're still trying to learn how to do it. A lot of it depends on how much Einheit you had before the pandemic hit. Trying to bring a new person totally on board in a team-based environment may be a real challenge. Now, I do some work with the Lean Kanban folks, Lean Kanban University, and I know they're working very hard on trying to adapt their stuff to the work at home environment. And their stuff is explicitly based on a lot of Boyd's materials. So I have hopes that that will work out, but I think we're still very early in that process. It's about all the answer I can give you for right now, I'm afraid.
Okay, thank you.
Next up is going to be Christian, followed by Rupali. Christian.
Hi, Chet. I've been thinking quite a lot about the issue of echo chambers in organizations. And in particular, I'm thinking about organizations operating in a very fast changing environment, say the technology or media industries. A way to overcome echo chambers seems to be to increase the organization's internal diversity so that there are more sort of eyes and ears directed towards the environment who can take in more data and also there's more complexity in such an organization in terms of processing these inputs. So far, so good. But I wonder about the interplay between this solution to the echo chamber problem and the cohesion issue. There seems to be like an antagonism between being able to have a good membrane with the external world and having good internal cohesion. So I wonder, do you have any strategies or observations with regard to this problem, if you think it is a problem?
Well, that's a very, very good question. One of the things that distinguishes this whole approach, going all the way back to Boyd and all the way back to India, was the idea of breaking trade-offs. And they put a huge amount of emphasis. Anytime you have a apparent trade-off, you look for what we call a deeper understanding that will allow you to break the trade-off. So for example, Toyota, you had quality and you had cost, and they traded off. To make one better, the other one got worse. But by focusing on waste, you can improve them both at the same time. In maneuver, warfare and Boyd's kind of stuff, the basic trade-off appears to be something like control and initiative, which gets to your, hey, you pump up the initiative, but then you lost control. The objective didn't get accomplished. So then you try to get more control. You killed initiative, so you didn't get the creativity that you needed to survive in the marketplace. And the way that you broke that trade-off was essentially that four-part climate, and particularly the very first one, Boyd's very first one, Einheit, a mutual cohesion, mutual trust that comes from working together over a period of time. Now, very interesting thing though that you pointed out there that one of the problems, and this goes back to Boyd's very, very first paper, Destruction and Creation, is if you're going to make your organization work better, to some extent, you got to focus internally. But an internal focus by itself will, quote, pump up entropy. In other words, it will increase the amount of confusion and disorder. It'll increase the amount of internal coordination that's needed, meetings that you have. In other words, energy that's in your organization, but not doing useful work. Let me, hey, Shrikant, if I can get you back in for just a second, I'm going to.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Yeah, this time I'll be right. I'm gonna go back over and I'm gonna pick out, I'll put my glasses on. I apologize for that. I'm gonna pick out one more chart. Let me think. Where's my Einheit. Okay, I'll be right with you. I just gotta find the right one for a beautiful chart.
Take your time.
And of course, it's never where you want it when you need it. So hold on just a minute. Let me take a second here. I thought I knew right where it was. I just briefed these a few days ago. Ah, there it is. Okay. I'll go back and share my screen. I'm not going to put this one up on play because we really don't need it. This is essentially how you stay inside and outside at the same time. We've talked about Einheit and everybody working together, but as you said, as you pointed out quite correctly, that leads to an echo chamber. We sometimes call that groupthink. It also leads to a tendency to tell the senior person what they want to hear, even if they don't understand that that's really what they want to hear, which is why I think Andy Grove titled his book, Only the Paranoid Survive. So how do you stay paranoid? Look at what's inside the white box down here. So the question is, and it gets back here to diversity. It's not just we're getting people diverse because they come from different backgrounds. That's probably good because different backgrounds mean more different sources of creativity. But when they come up with them, what do you as a leader do? And again, it's people say, oh yeah, I do this. I support my cage rattlers and all that. And then the next thing you should say is, oh really? Show me. Who have you promoted? Let's ask the people in your group anonymously without you present, who's getting promoted, who's getting raises, who's getting sent off to MBA programs, who's getting assignments to lead teams and that sort of thing. And you may find something different than you, but it's definitely a leadership issue. If the top leaders are not interested in focusing to the outside, then you're going to focus internally, and all the problems that Boyd and other management gurus have talked about for years are going are going to bite you. So with that in mind, we can stop the screen share now.
Thank you.
So that, Russ, so there's an idea for you, in other words.
Fantastic. Great question, Christian, and great.
Very good question, yeah.
Next up is going to be Rupali, followed by Aaron. Rupali.
Thank you, Shrikant and Chet. I wanted to ask you, in your book, you talk about W. Edwards Deming and his philosophy. How are Deming's business philosophy similar to the OODA Loop, or how are they different?
Very, very, very good question. I like Deming a lot. Boyd really didn't. Boyd thought Deming was too formula oriented, but I didn't. I thought Deming was great for a number of reasons. One of them, he said the customer is the most important part of the production line. And everybody says, yeah, we're customer focused. But then you go back that same thing. Oh, really? Show me. But the other thing that I like about Deming was his common causes and special causes. I mean, that's in a sense, it's just basic statistics, but by the nature of business, it can get lost. And at Lockheed, I remember I was there, bless their hearts, as we say here in the South. Lots and lots of really smartest people I ever met, I swear to God, were at Lockheed. But the organization itself hadn't come up with last new airplane that they did when I came there was 1965, when they won the C-5A contract. So lots of good people and lots of activity, but not a lot of new stuff rolling out the front door. But anyway, anytime they had a problem on the production line, any problem at all, they would write a procedure to make sure that problem never happened again. And they actually had several departments down within industrial engineering to write a procedure to ensure that problem never occurred again. Of course, what they had was they had rooms filled with books of procedures that nobody ever looked at. Nobody ever had time and because it had been written by industrial engineering and passed to the shop floor, people on the shop floor weren't invested in it at all, unlike Toyota standard work, where the people on the shop floor write the standard work to document the best way they can think of to do the job right now, and so it's quite a bit different. So I think those are two areas, particularly where I thought Deming was very, was very good, and certainly in harmony with what Boyd was saying. Now, Deming was not a strategist. That was not what he claimed to be. What he was trying to do was make your organization work better. His 14 points for management, I think, are outstanding. They shouldn't be taken as a checklist. But then Boyd himself had lists of things too, so he really wasn't one to totally complain. One of them that he said that is absolutely critical for Einheit. And I think if you only remember one thing about Deming, this is important. If you have a ranking system for your employees, you will find it very difficult to have Einheit, because now all the employees in your organization are in conflict with each other. So if you have a ranking system like Andy Grove did, like many places did, where you have a top 25%, a middle 50%, and a bottom 25%, or even the bottom 10%, like Jack Welch used to have, that are going to get let go, then people are going to do what they think they need to do to stay out of that bottom 10%. And that will include, being very sycophantic with the boss. It will include, if not sabotage, it will certainly include whatever they can do to ensure they get credit for whatever happened and somebody else doesn't, because the bottom 10% are going to get fired. So why wouldn't you do whatever it took to? So you can see it's very difficult to have mutual trust to where somebody deliberately doesn't do something that they could do, but to make the whole, it passes an idea along to somebody else in the team, said, you're better positioned to run with this than I am. Go for it. Our SharePoint right now is to get this design out, and I can contribute here, but I think you do a better job over there. So why don't you take the lead on this one? That doesn't happen, particularly in organizations where the bottom 10% are going to get fired. Just for example, and Deming specifically says that, and it's just so ignored. Another one was eliminate slogans and exhortations to the workplace, because you're just telling the workers now you have no idea what you're doing. We don't know how to solve these problems, so we'll put up a poster that says you solve them.
Just a quick follow-up. Deming, though he did not when he was not popular here in the US, he was popular in Japan. Japanese took
It was
it.
in parts of Japan. Toyota does not give Deming very much.
Okay.
Very much, and rightfully so. I mean, he had very little, if nothing, to do with the design of the Toyota production system. However, they still have the Deming Prize every year. Deming, that was not really the problem he was working on. He was working on the kind of things we were talking about. Kanban and the pull system and Judoka and all that evolved over about 25 years of experimentation on the factory floor. And certainly they used a lot of Deming's ideas, but there's very little statistical process control in a functioning Toyota plant, for example.
Wonderful. And it looks like your book also is having a better reception in Japan than anywhere else, right?
Actually, I think I have. I just got my latest sales figures from Japan. I may have still sold more books in the US, but that's over 17 years. Yeah, it's been very popular in Japan. I'm extremely grateful to my agent, my publisher over there, and my translator.
Wonderful. So next up is going to be Aaron, followed by Mike. Aaron.
Great. Thank you, Shrikant. And Chet, really appreciate it. Great book and
Thank you very much.
Great talk. In your blog, it was really great to see your parents and picture of your parents. I think around 1960.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, your dad was a commander of an ACR. So I was in
the 1st Recon Squadron, 2nd ACR.
I was in 2 ACR also. So.
Oh, where you were when?
1990. So 90.
It was still 2 ACR. Hadn't become a 2nd Cav then.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, did you know Doug McGregor?
Yeah, of course.
Did you? Wow.
Well, I didn't know him personally. I mean, like, I didn't know him like.
Yeah. I know him. I don't say very well, but well enough that we email back and forth.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Great guy, one of my heroes.
And also
HR McMaster.
Yeah, exactly. Also HR McMaster, who was a group cav leader. So
yeah.
But no. So my question was your point of view on applying OODA's OODA loops to innovation and product development, or sustaining them, and the design processes, which to be successful, obviously have to be very customer centric. You almost argue red team driven. Very close, purple, red.
Report towards a good
orange,
idea.
I guess is what we used to say. And organizational culture tends to, celebrate that as like, look, we're being innovative, innovative day, or, customer day, or red team day, but then we reconcile back into our sort of P&L mode and into our sort of operations mode. What is your perspective on applying, this is an idea I've had for a while, applying OODA loops more towards the operational side to sort of shake their sentiments of engagement, because it seems like we focus all of it on kind of the cool people, but the cool people always seem to try everything anyways. But the people who are in more of those, let's call it, accountant type roles, they tend to, your operations roles, they tend to be much more conservative or resistant. So have you thought about that, or have any experience or a point of view on that?
Actually, I haven't, unfortunately. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like, you have to have those folks, but everybody wants to blame them. Everybody talk about bean counters. It was a great project till the bean counters got a hold of it, or until the lawyers got a hold of it, or something like that, which may or may not, of course, be true. One thing though, and it seems like successful applications of this seem to need something. If you just go up to the for example, the salespeople and say, you need to start applying OODA loops to sales, they're going to take it as a criticism of what they're already doing. And they're going to, be defensive about it. If the top boss says, we're going to do OODA loops now, what typically happens, everybody salutes and then goes on about doing what they were doing anyway. So coming in from another angle on it, coming in from the flanks, might well be a good idea. I expect a lot of it depends on the organization itself. Another possibility is if you have skunk works, or if you have independent divisions or teams, or if you have companies that have kind of their own startup, they're doing entrepreneurship sort of things. that might be a possibility, as well. But you're right, it's very, very difficult. An existing unit already has all of its relationships. And think of it like this. The people that make the decisions about what kind of culture you're going to have, who's going to do what, who's going to get what promotions, who's going to go off to what school, who's going to get what assignments. Those people, they are products of the current system. In their heart of hearts, they don't see anything wrong with the current system. They may intellectually understand it, but in the heart of hearts, can't be too bad. It may be a vice president. I mean, so it's really, really, really difficult, for those folks. And so sometimes, and going straight up to them, as I have tried to do, and say, what you're doing now is all wrong. This is really what you need to know. There is a really tough sell. So,
I mean, one thing I found is that when you orient them sense probe to a competitor, right? So somebody that's not changing, but then you point out a competitor, a product, a service, whatever it is that clearly is doing something different, different response from their customers or from yours. I found that people sometimes just bury their heads right back down.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean,
they're just counting the clock out.
They're taking it as criticism, and they're going to protect themselves from it.
Yeah.
It's just extremely extreme. And you can show them P&L numbers, you can show them our ROI is going down, our EBITDA is going to hell, and all this, and doesn't make any difference. It's just really, I think Tom Peters had the best one. At some point, you just need to sell the company off and go start another one.
Thank you.
That's why it's so fascinating to watch, Elon Musk's organizations, because they're young and vibrant and strong now. But he's written, he's worried. If you read Liftoff, that story of SpaceX, you can see as it's starting to get big, it's starting to have some of these same issues.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Mike, John, Tom, and Madeline. Mike.
I'll try to be quick. Go ahead. Mike.
I'm trying to separate in my mind strategy versus tactics. The Blitzkrieg worked for piercing the Maginot Line.
It went north of Maginot Line, yeah.
It worked on that real well, but he didn't have, Hitler did not have a strategy for supplying and for holding that territory and for adapting it to the rest of the war, and that's probably probably the main reason he lost. Although there's a lot of reasons he lost.
I agree. I agree totally. Blitzkrieg is it's tactical and operational. It's how to fight the battle. It's how to maneuver between battles. But for example, he had no real strategy against Russia. He went against Leningrad, Moscow, and the Caucasus, all three at the same time, and essentially snowshoed. Plus, you have to give the Russians credit. By that time, too, Stalin had sort of recovered and figured out what was going on, brought Zhukov back from Siberia, and I was beginning to figure all this stuff out. Stalin, stayed in Moscow, and not that he had anywhere else to go, and was there along with everybody else. So you have to give him a certain amount of credit. But you're right, the Blitzkrieg is tactical and operational. It's not strategic. It's certainly not grand strategic. Grand strategic is how you deal with allies, how you attract them committed to your cause, how you keep your own team psyched up. Nazism is a racially oriented philosophy. That's how it differs from garden variety fascism, specifically based on race. Well, there are not that many Germans in the world. Is probably my best way to say it. And there's a whole lot of people that didn't fit into the racial makeup of the Third Reich and the way that the world was going to be at Hitler won. So in the end, probably had 50 people that wanted to fight him for everyone that wanted to fight with him, and that's a tough one to win. So
thank you. Next,
the OODA Loop, though, we have a similar problem with the OODA Loop as how to take that into today's battlefield situation and today's corporate situation. I could see Einheit knowing the layout is good and root cause analysis is good, agility is good, but how do you apply it to say a corporate problem like that we might have, or how do you apply it to say our current Afghan situation?
Well, our current Afghan situation is pretty simple. We've been there 20 years. How much longer you want to stay? How's it working out for you? No, it would be very depends. A very good question, Mike. It'd be very dependent on the specific company. Basically, focus on orientation in the few minutes that we have left. Put your spare point on orientation, and go from there. More specific than that would depend on the specific company.
All right, so we'll do quick questions and quick answers. So we finish by 7 o'clock. So it's going to be John, Tom, and Madeline. John, what's your question?
Hi, Chet. Hey, I'm enjoying your book. So thanks for writing it. I find it very, very enlightening. My question's around using the OODA loop within the organization. So one sort of discrepancy I'm noticing is that sort of John Boyd, he sort of gives this anecdote about how he used the OODA loop to sort of get the fighter jet programs change trajectory. He sort of used the OODA loop within the Pentagon. Mm-hmm. But the Pentagon itself is sort of like an organization that, could be said to be the military. And so you would say on one hand, there's like two systems going on. There's the military that's sort of trying to use the OODA loop to win wars and things. And then there's sort of John Boyd within the Pentagon. And so my question is, how do you use the OODA loop within the organization? Because it seems that within any system, any sort of radical or innovative change within that system is going to run up against resistance, either from top down or from other people, much to what some of the other people have talked about.
There is no simple answer. There is no one answer that would fit each one. The overall answer is that in applying the OODA loop, start with orientation. You do that a decision, that hypothesis test, decision hypothesis is how you essentially add stuff to your organization, things that your organization can do. And the implicit guidance and control link is whoever it is that has the ability to decide what actions you're going to do, typically the leader or the CEO or whatever like that. They said that they should do that as implicitly as possible. Jim Collins has a really good thing. He says, essentially, if you've done orientation properly, you really understand the brutal facts. And most times it's really pretty clear, what some good actions are. Also, you could look at Gary Klein's recognition prime decision making. If you Google Gary Klein, Sources of Power was his first book, but he has several others out there. Is also very good on that. It's essentially the same thing Boyd is talking about. Other than that, I'd have to really understand more about your specific organization. But it's a very, very good question, and wish I could spend time and try to go into more detail with you. But I think we only have 2 minutes left,
Yes.
5 minutes left, so I'm getting ready to get
Tom, what's your question?
Okay, I have to be real short here. Is there any relationship between your conflict patterns and Christopher Alexander's patterns of architecture? Which were,
the answer to that is I don't have a clue because I don't know anything about
Okay,
way
let's
beyond
go to the next one.
my area of expertise.
Let's do Madeline.
Looking for those kind of relations is a very good idea. I just can't help you. I don't know Christopher Alexander.
Sounds good. Madeline.
Yes, thank you, Chet. This is just absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.
And I love your slides. Extremely well done. My question has been evolving as people have been speaking, but basically the discussion of the orientation section of the OODA Loop, which has the genetic heritage, analyses and syntheses, previous experiences, new information, and cultural traditions. Mm. It seems to relate to what Kristen was talking about how to get out of the echo chamber of an organization.
Madeline, can you just summarize the question? We don't
have
a question in there.
Yes, I'm about to finish my sentence. And I was wondering if you could address if you've been able to apply orientation in that way to organizations that are kind of stuck and closed.
That's a really, really, really good question. And the short answer is there are examples of where it's been done, but in virtually every case, it is as Taiichi Ono, the guy who did the Toyota production system, said it's when they don't feel like they have any choice left, then they're willing to consider these sort of things. Essentially, the orientation is a model of how one individual's human brain works. And it's based on Boyd's, at that time, very rudimentary understanding of neurophysiology. Oddly enough, new discoveries in neurophysiology have backed a lot of that stuff up. For example, the mental models, the important thing there is that it predicts the effects of potential action. A lot of things using techniques like fMRI, you may be familiar with, have been able to show that a lot of that activity takes place in the prefrontal cortex, right in front of your head, but a lot of it doesn't. A lot of it is buried deep in the brain, and we don't really know what's going on back in there. But what appears to be happening is that your brain, all 85 to 100 billion neurons, and they're all operating all the time, and they have thousands of connections between each individual neuron, is making massively parallel predictions about the future given certain things, and then it's picking one of those as something to do it. It passes those forward to the prefrontal cortex and said, kind of, here's what we think you ought to do. And that's entered popular, you say lexicography, because people will say, for example, where the heart leads, the mind will follow. So there's all this stuff going on in the back of the brain involving those 5 things. Now, when you get groups of people involved, then for one thing, you can't really talk about genetic heritage. You start getting into racism, you start talking about genetic heritage of groups, and Boyd was definitely not a racist. So what you have to do there is start talking about similar orientations, but not exactly the same. And then there's what you have to get when you also have to have in your organization some people that don't really seem to fit. That seems to be really, really important. One of the military commanders I work with says it's like every good unit's got a couple of savvy Mexicans, and he said, I don't mean that, insensitive. I just mean people who have lived on the street with violence and that understand what it really means to engage in combat with people, and that understand the need for deception and ambiguity and finding an unexpected way and that sort of thing. Is that if you've grown up with that, if you've lived in a neighborhood growing up, that you kind of understand it. Every organization needs some outsiders like that. So yeah, and it's really insidious, because if you try to work too hard on the inside of the organization to fix it, then you run into the problems of internal focus. And you lose track not only of your customers, but you also start pumping up the confusion and disorder within your own system. And you see that as, for example, more meetings, more regulations, larger legal staff, making sure people comply with this, that, or the other thing too. Yeah, I can't give you a better answer than that. I'm afraid, but that's sort of a data dump of what I can tell you.
Thank you. All right, Chet, this was an honor. This was amazing. Folks, the link to the book is in the chat. There is also a link to Chet's website. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Shrikant. Appreciate the opportunity. Best of luck to everybody, and good luck. We'll sure talk to you all again some other time.
Wonderful. See you, folks.
Bye-bye.
Bye.